She smiled for the cameras, and then the doors closed. That is the story staff inside the household do not want getting out. Not one scandal. I mean, not one headline moment. Something quieter than that, and, honestly, something worse. A pattern. A version of Camilla that only exists when nobody official is watching. And, once you hear how many people have quietly said the same thing, in different rooms, years apart, never talking to each other, you start to understand why nobody has said it publicly, until now. So, stay with me.
Some voices are born to rule. Power is not given. This is the royal voice, where the crown speaks.
So let us get into it. It started, as these things always seem to, with someone who was never supposed to be quoted at all. A junior member of household staff, the kind of person who refills water glasses and holds doors and is trained from day one to be invisible. She immense, and invisible people notice everything because nobody performs for someone they have stopped seeing. According to this source, the difference is not subtle once you know to look for it. In public, Camilla is warm, practiced, yes, but warm. She remembers names. She laughs at the right moments. She touches an arm, leans in, makes whoever she is speaking to feel, for 30 seconds, like the only person in the room. That is not nothing. That is a skill. Diplomats have built careers on less. But here is the thing. The moment the cameras are gone and the doors are closed, something changes. Not dramatically, not with shouting, quietly, coldly. Staff describe a woman who stops making eye contact with anyone below a certain rank, who gives instructions rather than requests, who corrects people in front of others, softly, in a tone that somehow feels worse than yelling would. And I have to say, that detail is the one that stuck with me the most, not the coldness itself, the precision of it, because coldness that only comes out when there is no one important around to witness it is not a mood, that is control, and that raises the real question driving this entire story. Not whether Camilla has ever had a bad day, because everyone has. The real question is why the coldness only ever seems to surface around people who have no way of ever holding her accountable for it, and what that says about a woman the public has spent years learning to trust. So let us talk about what actually happens behind those doors. The first account comes from an event 2 years ago, a charity reception, the kind of evening built entirely around warmth and photographs. Camilla was, by every account, extraordinary that night. She spent nearly 10 minutes with a young volunteer who had organized part of the event, asking about her studies, her family, genuinely seeming to listen. Photographs from that night are the ones you have probably seen circulated as proof of how down-to-earth she is. But here is where it gets interesting. Roughly 20 minutes after the last photograph was taken, according to this source, that same volunteer approached Camilla again, this time without a photographer present, simply to ask a small logistical question about where guests should exit. And Camilla, without looking up from the program in her hand, said only one sentence. Someone should have told you that already. No warmth, no name, just correction, delivered like a closed door. You do not move from that kind of warmth to that kind of coldness in 20 minutes by accident. That is not a bad mood. That is a switch being flipped, deliberately, the instant the audience disappeared. Now, you might be thinking, so what? Powerful people are allowed off moments. Everyone has them. And that is a fair point. And honestly, it is the point Camilla's team would make too, if this ever became public in a formal way. Except this was not one moment. This is where the pattern starts to matter. A second source, from a different year entirely, someone who worked logistics for royal travel, describes something almost identical happening on a foreign visit. Camilla, in front of local dignitaries and press, was described as gracious almost to a fault, complimenting the host country's culture, asking thoughtful questions through a translator, seeming genuinely curious, the kind of behavior that makes headlines about her being an asset to the monarchy. But once the delegation moved to a private wing of the residence, away from any local officials, the tone reportedly shifted within minutes. A staff member handling the schedule was told, in front of colleagues, that they were, quote, clearly not paying attention, after what this source describes as an entirely reasonable scheduling question. No one corrected the record. No one apologized. The public version of that day and the private version of that day do not appear to be the same event at all. And here is what I keep coming back to. If this was one person's bad day, we would not be talking about it. But you have two separate sources from 2 different years on 2 different continents describing the exact same shape of behavior. Warmth switched on for cameras and dignitaries. Coldness switched on the instant they leave. That is not a personality. That is a performance with a very specific audience requirement. Okay, but here is where it gets even more specific. Because the pattern does not stop at travel and receptions. It follows her indoors, into the smaller, quieter corners of daily palace life, where you would think, if anywhere, someone might finally let their guard down in a harmless way. A third account, this one from someone who worked in a support role inside one of the residences for several years, describes something almost mundane on its surface, and that is exactly what makes it unsettling. Twice a week, roughly, a small team would prepare rooms ahead of scheduled visits. Nothing glamorous. Flowers, place settings, temperature checks, and according to this source, Camilla would occasionally walk through beforehand, unannounced, to inspect the arrangements. When everything was correct, there was no acknowledgement at all, not praise, not even a nod. Just silence, and she would move on. But on the occasions something was slightly off, a flower arrangement facing the wrong direction, a chair angled incorrectly. The same source describes a very specific tone entering her voice, not raised, almost worse than raised, flat, final. As if the person in front of her had personally disappointed her in some way that went beyond a chair being 3 inches out of place. Pay attention here, because this matters. The imbalance itself is the story. Getting it right earns nothing. Getting it wrong earns a very particular, very cold correction. That is not how someone treats colleagues they respect. That is how someone treats people they have decided do not need to be respected at all. So, here is the twist that changes how you have to read everything we have just walked through, because this is not simply about temper. No, it is about who gets the temper. Because here is the detail almost nobody talks about when they cover stories like this. It is never random who gets the cold version. It is not that Camilla is simply short-tempered with everyone once cameras leave. According to multiple sources, the coldness is reserved specifically for people who cannot push back. Junior staff, temporary hires, volunteers, people whose job security depends on staying quiet. Meanwhile, and this is the detail that changes everything, senior staff, longtime aides, people with real institutional standing, describe an entirely different private Camilla, consistent, measured, occasionally even warm in private, the same way she is in public. The switch does not flip for them. Think about what that actually means. If the coldness were simply exhaustion, or stress, or a private personality bleeding through, it would not be selective. It would not sort itself so neatly along lines of who has power to complain and who does not. That is not someone losing composure. That is someone calculating, in real time, who is safe to be unkind to, and that is not discipline. That is choreography. I want to sit with that for a second, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every account we have found follows the same rule: warm in front of anyone who could shape public perception. Cold toward anyone who could not shape anything at all. That is not a woman struggling with a difficult public role. That is someone who has learned precisely where the cameras end and where the consequences end, and who understands those are two very different boundaries entirely. There is a fourth account worth mentioning here, because it adds something the others do not. This one comes from someone who briefly worked alongside Camilla's personal team rather than the wider household, someone with slightly more access than most of the other sources we have gathered. And what they describe is not coldness exactly, it is something closer to strategy. According to this account, Camilla is reportedly extremely deliberate about which junior staff she allows near her during unscripted moments at all. Certain people, this source claims, are quietly rotated out of proximity to her after a single instance of what was described only as not reading the room correctly. No formal complaint, no paperwork, simply a scheduling adjustment that ensures that person is never near her again during moments without structure. If true, that detail reframes everything once more, because it means the coldness is not simply an occasional loss of composure that happens to be aimed at the powerless. It is closely managed. The people who see it are curated, and the people who see it more than once, apparently, do not tend to stay close for very long. There is a fifth account, and honestly, this is the one that took this from a private staff frustration to something much bigger, because for the first time, it involves someone slightly further up the chain, someone with enough standing to have actually pushed back, at least a little. This source describes a planning meeting ahead of a public engagement, the kind of routine session where schedules get finalized and nobody expects any tension at all. A junior aide, present to take notes, raised a small concern about timing, nothing controversial, simply flagging that a proposed schedule left almost no buffer between two engagements. According to this source, Camilla's response was immediate and, in this person's words, disproportionate. She reportedly said the aide was, quote, here to write things down, not to plan them, in front of at least 3 other people in the room. Here is what makes this account different from the others. A more senior person in that same meeting, someone with enough seniority to speak up, did gently note afterward, privately, that the comment had felt harsh. And according to this source, Camilla's reaction to that gentle pushback was not defensiveness, and it was not an apology either. It was, apparently, a brief pause, followed by a change of subject. No acknowledgement, no correction, just silence, used as a wall. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about how far this pattern extends up the chain before it hits any real resistance at all. It is not that senior staff never notice, it is that even when they do notice, and even when they gently raise it, there is no real consequence that follows. The moment simply gets absorbed and moved past, and the pattern continues exactly as it was. Now, here is where the story takes its turn in a different direction. Because there is one account that does not fit the pattern in the way you would expect, and it's the one that honestly worries people close to this the most. A former member of household staff, someone who left their position under circumstances that were never publicly explained, described a moment that took place away from any event entirely. No cameras anywhere near, no dignitaries, just Camilla alone in a private sitting room, with this staff member delivering a message from another senior royal. And according to this account, in that moment, with absolutely nobody to perform for, Camilla was neither cold nor warm. She was, in this person's words, tired, not in temper, in something closer to resignation. She reportedly sat quietly for a long moment after hearing the message, then said, almost to herself, that she was so tired of being the only villain in every version of this family. Sit with that for a second. Because if that account is accurate, it complicates everything we have just walked through. It suggests that somewhere underneath the calculated warmth and the selective coldness, there is someone who is fully aware of exactly how she is perceived, and who feels trapped inside that perception rather than comfortable inside it. That does not excuse the coldness toward people with less power. It does not erase the pattern, but it reframes the question. Because now you have to ask, is the coldness the real Camilla, finally showing through when no one important is watching? Or is the calculated warmth the real performance, and the coldness is what happens when a person who feels cornered by her own reputation finally runs out of patience for playing a role she never fully agreed to? Neither answer is comfortable. And honestly, that is exactly why staff who have witnessed this do not talk about it publicly, because there is no clean villain story here. There is only a woman who behaves one way when the institution is watching, another way when it is not, and apparently, a third way when she thinks absolutely no one is listening at all. There is one more account worth including here, because it comes from outside the household entirely, from someone who worked a single private event years ago and has no ongoing connection to any of this at all, which is exactly why this person felt comfortable describing it in detail. This source recalls driving as part of a small transport team for a private family gathering, unrelated to any official engagement. No press, no public element whatsoever. According to this account, Camilla spent much of the ride in comfortable, easy conversation with the other passengers in her car, people she considered peers. But when the car briefly stopped, and this driver, attempting simple politeness, asked whether the temperature inside was comfortable, the response was reportedly a single flat word, delivered without turning around. Fine. Nothing more. Not unkind exactly, but a wall going up. Instantly, the moment someone outside the circle of peers spoke at all. On its own, that is nothing. People are allowed to be quiet with strangers, but layered onto everything else, it becomes one more data point in the same shape. Ease and warmth, reserved for equals. A closed door for everyone else, regardless of the setting, regardless of whether there was ever a camera anywhere near. But let us go back to what this reveals about power inside that family, because that is really what this story is about. For decades, the entire royal project has depended on the idea that what you see in public is who these people actually are. Careful smiles, gracious words, controlled composure, all of it presented as authentic character rather than trained performance. And Camilla, more than almost anyone else in that family, has needed the public to believe that authenticity, because her position inside it was never guaranteed. She had to earn public tolerance the hard way, over decades, one carefully managed appearance at a time. Which is exactly why this pattern, if it is real, and if it is as consistent as these accounts suggest, matters so much more for her than it would for almost anyone else in that family. Because the entire foundation of her public rehabilitation was built on being seen as warm, human, down to earth. If that warmth turns out to be selectively deployed, rather than simply who she is, that does not just complicate her image, it threatens the entire narrative that got her accepted in the first place. You have to understand this. Every royal figure trades on some version of a public story. William trades on stability, Catherine trades on effortless grace, Anne trades on duty without complaint. Camilla's story, carefully built over 20 years, is warmth, ordinary, relatable, unglamorous warmth. It is the entire reason public opinion of her shifted as dramatically as it did. Take that away, or even just complicate it, and there is very little left holding that particular narrative up. And here is the detail that makes this especially precarious for her, specifically. Catherine's reputation for grace has, by every account we have ever come across, held up consistently in private as well as public settings. Same with Anne's reputation for bluntness, paired with fairness. Whatever people privately say about either of them, the private version and the public version are not described as opposites. They are described as consistent, just seen from closer up. Camilla is the one royal figure in this family where multiple, unconnected sources describe a private version that appears to directly contradict the public one. That is not a small distinction. That is the entire difference between a private life and a performance. That is not discipline. That is choreography, repeated so consistently across so many years and so many settings that at some point you have to stop calling it an exception and start calling it the actual behavior, with the warmth being the exception, performed on demand. And here is the part that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention. This is not staff being disloyal for no reason. Every single source described feeling as though they were not supposed to notice, let alone say anything. One described being pulled aside afterward and told, gently but unmistakably, that some things are simply not discussed outside these walls. Not a threat, just a very clear, very practiced closing of a door that tells you something important. This is not the first time someone has noticed. It is simply the first time it has traveled far enough to reach us. So where does this leave things? Right now, nothing has been said publicly, by Camilla or by the palace, because as far as anyone official is concerned, nothing happened. There was no incident, no headline moment, no single photograph anyone could point to and say, there, that is the proof. And that is precisely why this kind of pattern is so difficult to challenge. You cannot hold someone accountable for a mood that only a handful of powerless people ever witnessed, and who were quietly told afterward not to mention it again. But here is why I think this particular story matters more than the average staff complaint you hear about any public figure, because this is not really about whether Camilla is occasionally short with people. Almost everyone in a position of pressure has moments like that. This is about the shape of it. The consistency of who it happens to, and who it never happens to. The fact that senior figures who could push back simply do not get the cold version at all, while the people with the least power in the entire building get it reliably, over years, across completely different settings. That consistency is the part that should unsettle you. A single bad moment tells you nothing about someone's character. A pattern that sorts itself precisely along lines of who can and cannot fight back tells you almost everything. But patterns like this rarely stay contained forever. Staff move on to other households, other jobs, other conversations, in other kitchens, with people who are not bound by the same quiet loyalty. And once enough of those conversations happen in enough different places, eventually, someone talks to someone who is not inside the walls at all. Which raises the only question that actually matters now. If this really is a pattern, and not simply a handful of unrelated bad days stitched together by people with a grudge, then the real story was never about a single cold sentence in a hallway. It was about how long an institution can protect a carefully built image before the people who witness the truth behind it stop agreeing to stay quiet. And here is something worth considering, because it changes how quickly this could move from whispers to headlines. 6 separate sources, across different years, different countries, different roles inside and around that household, none of them connected to each other, as far as we can tell, all describing the same underlying shape. That is not one disgruntled employee. That is not a single grudge dressed up as a pattern. When accounts line up that precisely, without any coordination between the people giving them, that is usually the moment a story stops being gossip and starts being something closer to a documented behavior. And if even one more account like this surfaces, one with a name attached, instead of an anonymous source, this stops being a story about mood and starts being a story about character. That is a very different conversation for the palace to manage, because moods can be explained away. Character, once enough people have independently described the same version of it, becomes very difficult to spin. Think about what that would actually mean for the institution itself. This is a family that has spent decades managing image with extraordinary discipline, understanding that the public forgives almost anything, except the sense of being deceived. If the warmth that rehabilitated Camilla in the public eye turns out to have been reserved only for the people who could reward her for it, while something colder was kept for everyone who could not, that is not a story about one difficult morning. That is a story about who the institution decided was worth being kind to, and who was not. So, keep an eye on this one, because right now, this is still 6 quiet accounts, carefully guarded, deliberately anonymous, the kind of thing that exists mostly in private conversations between people who left those jobs years apart and never once compared notes. But stories like this, they rarely stay that small forever, and the moment even one of these people decides they are done staying quiet, the version of Camilla the public thinks it knows may not survive the retelling.